Boker Tov and good morning. I'm Rabbi Steve Moskowitz of Congregation Lador Vador here on Oyster Bay, Long Island. And this is Monday Musings, a 15-minute spiritual kickstart to the week, in which I'm joined by friends from far and wide to share some of their insights and their passions with us to start us off on the right foot for the week. So this morning, I'm very excited. I'm joined by my friend, the Reverend Dr. Michael Piret, the rector of Christ Church in Oyster Bay, a neighbor. So I'm so excited that Michael's going to be joining us here. And prior to coming to Oyster Bay and serving at Christ Church, which I know you've been there for about 5 years, Michael. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a joy to be with you.
Thank you. So prior to coming to Oyster Bay about 5 years ago, I know that you were one of the chaplains at Oxford University. And so you have to, I want you to explain what that meant there and sort of how you came to Oxford and what you learned there, because I know you went to Oxford many, many years ago to study English literature. And then along the way, you became a reverend and now clergy. So tell us the story.
The college where I worked is called Magdalen College, and it's named after St. Mary Magdalene. And it was begun in 1458. So it's one of the newer colleges in the university. And, you know, they were just finishing the very first buildings when I went there. So it seems, but actually I went there more recently than that. If it's famous for anything in particular, at the moment, it's famous for two writers, Oscar Wilde, who studied there, and C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia stories and so on. So it's well known for those two people. It's got a beautiful chapel in which I had the privilege of conducting about 15 services every week. And seven of them were sung by a kind of world-class choir. So lots of people came into the chapel just to attend our services. And lots of people came in just, quote unquote, to hear the music, and often found that actually that opened a door into faith for them. So it was an exciting place to work, and lots of variety, and met lots of interesting people working there. But I'd done it for just over 21 years. And, you know, with a while stretching between me and retirement, I wondered, well, okay, it's time to do something else for a while.
So, but I remember that you grew up in Buffalo. You were born in Buffalo.
Yeah.
And then you were studying, you got a master, you're going to get a master's in English literature, and that's what brought you to Oxford. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you didn't go there with the intention of becoming ordained.
No, I went to do a graduate course in English. Yeah, so that was my reason for going.
How do you get from English literature to where you are now?
Well, there's a lot of coming and going, obviously, between literature and faith. You know, between writing and faith, because people write about their faith, and what they read about other people's writings on faith influences and shapes them also. So you get from one to the other, I think, I think teaching undergraduates, you know, in an English course, that is also a kind of pastoral role, because we're really there reading the words of people who've been asking big questions and writing about big questions, but also writing about things that have to do with very particular personal feelings. And I think, you know, that's not 100 years away from the kind of things a pastor is dealing with in whatever faith. The big questions and the personal concerns.
So, but was there a moment, I mean, where that really, I mean, I think that's beautifully said, the connection between being a teacher and being a pastor, that there's a certain role of shepherding, I guess, that's a part of it, and helping people to ask questions and formulate answers and find themselves. But for you, that's not what you went there. You went there to get a degree in English literature. So was there a moment where it said, "Oh, I should be doing this"?
Yes, there were lots of moments, and I think a lot of people feel that way, don't they? Who end up in the whole clergy world in one way or another. It's as if, somebody's kind of, pulling on you from time to time and saying, come on, you should consider doing something about this. And when I say somebody's pulling on you, I mean somebody with a capital S, is pulling on you. And I think, you kind of take that plunge and explore the possibility of service as a clergy person when you get to the point where you feel you've just got to do something about it. You've got to ask the question, you've got to take it to the religious authorities of the faith that you're aligned with, and they evaluate. I don't know what the experience was like for you, but for me, you go to various meetings and you go to something called a selection conference, and all these people are looking at you and these other candidates trying to work out who they can envision with one of these things on and doing this sort of thing. And then you go through training after that, which I was lucky enough to do in the Episcopal Church in Scotland. And I served there for a couple of years before going back to Oxford in my new role, my new ordained role.
But so, when talking to my Christian friends who are priests and reverends, the notion of call is very different than it would be. I would describe it more as some sort of internal recognition, and often I hear from my friends and colleagues that it's much more the word you used, pull, that there was an like outside
pull, yeah. And it's interesting you use the words internal recognition, and that's a really big part of it. But I think also, in any religion, be it Judaism or Christianity, there's obviously going to be some need for some recognition from somebody else as well. Otherwise, the structure of the denomination isn't going to be there. Not just anyone, I guess, can just, well, you can, you can put a sign outside your door and say, I'm a priest in a church of my own invention, something like that.
I think people have done that throughout the centuries.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah. But usually, it's two things. It's the inner recognition, and then there's kind of affirmation by the faith community.
And so I want to unpack a little bit more the relationship between English literature. You and I have spent, a number of times, a number of conversations talking about the power of poetry. We both have our favorite poets, and they speak to us and help us in our faith. Can you say a little bit more about poetry and its role?
Well, I mean, a poet is, etymologically, a poet is someone who makes something. A poet is a maker. And I think one of the things that poetry does that connects closely to faith is it not only makes meaning, not just in the sense of making meaning up, because it's doing more than that, I think, with religious poetry, but, it makes meaning and it articulates meaning in a way that can work intellectually, in a way that can work emotionally. And so, you can, reading poems, feel like you really know someone.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of companionship.
Yeah, I found poetry, there's just certain times that a poem or a line just grabs me. It's like, oh, that's it. That crystallizes it, what I've been searching for, or elucidates something that I wasn't even thinking about. There's a bit of revelation in a poem that works. And I could share it with someone else, and they'll be like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Very true. Yeah. So there's something personal about that level of response, definitely.
Right.
But yeah, I think because poetry is a crafting of words, people can, if they're good at it, they can articulate something that either you've never thought of before, or you think, I know exactly what this person means, and they have put it into words for the first time. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't just happen with poems either. I mean, if you think about the great Russian novels. Think about Dostoevsky, for example. He was such a psychologist that every now and then he'll describe something and you say, I know exactly what he's talking about, but I just never thought of anyone ever being able to articulate it.
Right. The way that they describe it and the power of the language is really just so incredible. So you have favorite poets or favorite poems, I assume?
Yeah, I've got favorite poets and favorite poems, and I've got a few volumes out here because I didn't know what direction things were going to go. I suppose one thing that I've got here is the opening of Paradise Lost by John Milton, because it's, he wrote it to be the ultimate Christian poem. That was his idea, that he was going to write a Christian poem which you could put next to the Iliad and the Odyssey. Mm-hmm. He was going to do it, and it's incredible because it's a hugely intellectual construction. There's another poet I'm really interested in named George Herbert. And a lot of people haven't heard of George Herbert, but he was born in the 1590s and he died in 1633. And he was an Anglican priest, Church of England priest. And he was very successful academic, very brilliant, very privileged, came from a very well-to-do family. And probably he was a member of parliament. Anyway, at a point in the 1620s, he kind of drops off the map and people don't really know what he was doing for a little while. And then he reemerges being ordained, and he served in a parish near Salisbury, getting towards the southwest of England, a place called Bemerton, where he was buried in the floor of the church after he died. He had 3 years as a parish priest before he died at the age of 39, and he would have been totally forgotten if he hadn't left behind a little volume of poems with the title The Temple. And he handed that over to be given to his best friend, and asked for his best friend to evaluate it. This was Herbert on his deathbed, hands over his poems. And the poems were published by the University Press in Cambridge shortly after Herbert died. And they have become incredibly famous. And he's a very accessible writer for us today. And you can't say that of many people who wrote in the early 1600s.
I would say not. So that's so interesting, his story. So he gave up all of his privilege, and we don't have journals or anything, his reflections as to this choice he made?
His journals and his reflections are his poems, because he wrote a lot about his whole interior landscape. He wrote a lot about his emotions, and he described his poems as a kind of description, he said, of many conflicts that he had with his Lord. He said, "In whose service I have now found perfect freedom." That's the quote from Herbert. So there's a lot of, Herbert is like, he's like the psalmist. He's, this kind of back and forth, and sometimes he gets mad at God, and sometimes it's all sweetness and light. And it's that whole range of emotions that we get in the Psalms. You get that range of emotions in Herbert's poems as well.
So this sort of this inner conflict is revealed in this book of poems. And his struggles.
That's right. Yeah, he's got one poem which is called "The Collar," and we think of it as being a clerical collar. He may have meant that, he might not have done. But apart from the fact that he uses board to mean table, we can understand how he begins. He says, "I struck the board and cried, 'No more,'" he says to God. "I don't want this vocation," and towards the end, he's got these lines that, as I raved and grew more fierce and wild with every word, he thought he heard a voice saying, "My child." And I replied, "My Lord." So, you got this emotion and then it gets resolved at the end.
Yeah, but again, part of that conflict is that this is not he doesn't feel his vocation was a personal choice as much as something that he was told to do.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's true of him. Yeah.
And that's a very interesting way of seeing, our role. If this is something that you are commanded, or as opposed to, this is a career path that I have chosen.
Yeah, that I'm going to do for a couple of years and then give it up and go into
I
investment
can
banking.
give it up if I want to, so to speak.
Yeah, that's right.
That creates a tremendous amount of wrestling.
Yeah.
So why do you think that so resonates with you?
Because I read Herbert way before I was ever ordained myself. I think it was somebody writing about spiritual experience. That's basically what he did. That's what he was interested in doing in his poems, writing about spiritual experience. And maybe that's one reason he wondered why he wondered whether his poems should be published or not, because he thought on the one hand they might help other people, and on the other hand he thought, oh no, this is just self-indulgent, it's all just about me. So yeah, there
is a fine line, of course, between writing and poetry, and whether it's going to serve and model for others, or whether it's really just interior kind of debate that should remain internal.
Preoccupation with ourself. Yeah.
Yes. So Herbert really was part of your path.
Oh yeah, I think he's definitely part of my path. Yeah. The riches of Herbert are great, and he became really popular among professional literary critics. He became really popular again about 50 years ago. There's a whole huge number of books written about Herbert. I think that I've often thought slightly mischievously, one of the reasons for this is Herbert is somebody who, within a week, you can kind of read everything he ever wrote. He fits into one volume. So,
right. That's a rather large volume, though.
Michael. It is a large volume, but the type is big. You can read all of his poems in one long day, all of his English poems in one long day.
It would be an interesting side discussion, just a thought, like why certain, poets who wrote hundreds of years ago, they become popular at different times, and people gravitate towards them.
Yeah, I mean, another reason that Herbert became popular is the infinitely more famous poet T.S. Eliot was interested in Herbert and, called him again to the world's attention.
Oh, so that is a crucial point in terms of like that there was a champion of him.
Yeah, that helped a lot.
Yeah, I think that is a piece. Look, why don't we close with you have, I'm sure, a Herbert poem at your side to share with us.
Yeah, I've got one, and I'll tell you a little bit about it, and I'm also going to be irritating but helpful, I hope, while I read it, because every now and then there will be a word or a phrase that I'm going to slightly rephrase in a way that makes it easier for somebody in our era to understand.
Thank you. I appreciate the translation.
I'm not going to tell you the title of this poem because you're going to find it even more confusing. I'll tell you the title of it afterwards. Okay. But it's a poem about creation and the creation of humanity. And behind it all, I've got to say is, and I think anyone would agree, are very famous words of St. Augustine, who wrote, Lord, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. Lord, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. So those words of St. Augustine are behind this poem, I'm sure. And what Herbert is talking about is God creating man. And it's like all these blessings in the world are in a glass, and God is pouring these blessings into this creature. And there's one thing that he decides to hold back, and that is the blessing of rest. Right? Lord, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. Okay, so let me read this poem, and I'll explain some things as I go along. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by, let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches, which dispersed lie, contract into a span. Just let all the riches of the world go into this new creature that he's making, be concentrated in this new creature. So strength first made a way, then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honor, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made a stay. God stopped for a moment, perceiving that alone of all his treasure in this glass, rest in the bottom lay. For if I should, said he, bestow this jewel also on my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me, and rest in nature, not the God of nature. So both should losers be. And here's the last verse. Yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast.
Beautiful. That was, it's a beautiful poem.
Lord, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. It's the one thing that that the Lord doesn't put into us. The one thing the Lord withholds so that we will make our way to the Lord.
But restlessness and patience can serve, is, sort of, that's the sense that I have.
That's true too. That's part of the calling, is never to be quite satisfied.
Right. Beautiful. Michael, thank you so much for teaching us. I am so grateful.
It's nice to be with you.
This was Monday Musings. Join us again next week at 9 a.m.